So here we will study about the factor proportion theory, or we can say Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Primary work was done in 1919 by Ali Heckscher and later Bertin Ohlin added in 1933, who was also a student of Heckscher. So this theory was primarily discovered by Heckscher, but as Bertin Ohlin was also a student of Ali Heckscher, he also joined him in 1933 and he continued with this theory. So, what is this theory about? This theory is based on a country's production factors like land, labor, and capital only, which provide the funds for investment in plants and equipment. They focus their attention on how a country could gain comparative advantage by producing products that utilize factors that were in abundance in the country. All right, so here what we are going to study, if a country has advantages in the factors, that is land, labor, and capital, so they can gain comparative advantage by producing products that utilize these factors. It state countries which are rich in labor should export labor intensive good, and countries rich in capital should export capital intensive good. Here I have taken an example of US and India. As has capital abundance and easily available, but labor is expensive, so they should produce goods like machinery, which is capital incentive, and export it to. Whereas India, labor is easily available in India and it has abundance in quantity, while capital is scarce. So they should produce goods like cotton, which is labor intensive, and export it to. US will produce goods which have capital intensive like machinery and they will export it, whereas India will export cotton goods which required labor intensive. So this theory is also called 2 by 2 by 2. Why 2 by 2 by 2? Because two countries are involved, two factors are involved, and two goods are involved in this theory. So two countries A plus B, we can say A country, B country. Two factors are capital and labor, as we already discussed. Do two goods would be, one good would be based on capital intensive and another good would be based on labor intensive. So now we are going to take the assumption, or we can say example. So here we are taking the assumption like no transport cost is involved, free trade is going on, no restrictions and barriers are there, perfectly competitive market, like both the country have equal competition and they are also competitive, constant return to scale, full employment of resources, like there is no lack of resources. So if capital by labor of country A is greater than capital in ratio of labor of country B, so price of capital to the labor ratio of country A is lesser than the price of capital to the labor ratio of country B. Thus, country A will tend to export the capital intensive goods, which is X, and import the labor intensive goods, which is Y, and country B shall do exactly the opposite. Here country A is capital abundant country and country B is labor abundant country. So if a country is has capital intensive and in capital abundant, they should export the capital goods, whereas if a country has produce labor intensive goods, they should export labor intensive goods. So this is very a simple theory and an interesting one. So this was the third theory which I have explained you. Hope this would help. Here I am going to explain you about the Leontief paradox. So it is basically the remaining part of the factor proportion theory. Later on, when the Heckscher-Ohlin theory was proved, Leontief, who was also a member on in Heckscher-Ohlin theory, he found some expectations on Heckscher-Ohlin theory. That is, in the early 1950s, Russian-born American economist Wesley W. Leontief found that factor proportion theory has some expectations. Why it is called paradox? Because he studied something and he proved that that wasn't completely true, or talking on the basis of fact, the US economy he studied very closely and found that the US, which has abundance of capital, should export capital goods and labor import intensive goods. But his research using actual data showed the opposite, that US was importing more capital intensive goods. His analysis became known as the Leontief paradox, a paradox identified by the Russian economist Wesley W. Leontief stated that in the real world, the reverse of the factor proportion theory or Heckscher theory exists in some countries. For example, even though country may be abundant in capital, it may still import more capital intensive goods. Later, when Leontief found that the labor in the USA was more productive and in steady reply, and this was the reason US exported more labor intensive goods. However, what remains clear is that international trade is complex and is impacted by numerous and often changing factors. Trade cannot be explained neatly by only one single theory. So this is very simple and in a very clear words which I have mentioned about the Leontief paradox.